Welcome back to Unpacking Ideas, and thanks for joining if you're new here. Today we're going to be unpacking Paradiso by Dante Alighieri. This is part 3 of a 3-part series we did on Dante's Divine Comedy, so if you haven't listened to the first 2 episodes, be sure to check those out because we pick up here where we left off there. Today, helping me unpack this book again was Phil Kobosov. Phil is the leader of the New York Mythology Group and a longtime student of the Commedia. In this conversation, we discussed the cosmology of paradise, the Ptolemaic conception of the universe, the symbolism of the different planets and heavenly bodies, the 4 classical virtues and the 3 Christian virtues. In specific, we focused in on faith and justice. We talked about Dante's ideas on free will, egalitarianism, the limits of language, transhumanism, non-dualism. We talked about Dante's vision of God and the returning of the Boon. This has been just such a rewarding experience going through the Commedia with Phil. I hope that if you're somebody who's been with us since episode 1, you've enjoyed the journey, hopefully learned some new things. And here it is, the final stretch, my conversation with Phil on Paradiso. All right, cool. So we're here to discuss Paradiso. So welcome back, Phil.
Thank you. Excited to be in the final stretch.
Exactly. Yeah. So just to kind of catch everybody up where we left off, Dante had just bathed in the river of Lethe. And what's the other? How do you pronounce the other? Eunoe. Okay.
Yeah, so the first one is you wash away the memories of the sinful memories, I guess. And the Eunoe is the one that kind of reinvigorates you to the new life. So it, again, infuses you with the virtues and so on.
Yeah. Right.
It literally means good mind.
Okay.
Or like good knowledge, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. So we had just kind of left off there, and Purgatorio ended with them saying they're now ready for the stars.
Ready for the stars.
And I was thinking before we jump into it, we just take a little time to discuss the geography of Paradiso, kind of like we did with the others, because there's some interesting symbolism and some interesting things to point out. And I mean, first of which, it's, I guess, important to note that during the time they still had a geocentric kind of conception of the universe, and, you know, the Earth being the center. And so that's one of the reasons why, the Paradiso is kind of laid out the way it is. But do we want to say more about the Ptolemaic system?
Let's get into it a little bit. So the backdrop for Dante's cosmology, I would call it cosmology more than geography, because, again, we're standing on at the top of Mount Purgatory, still on Earth, but basically ready to leave Earth and go on this cosmic journey. I call this canto, or this canticle, the cosmic journey, right? Because we're actually going to be traveling through the stars to infinity and beyond.
Yeah.
So the cosmology of Dante in this in Paradiso pretty much follows the Ptolemaic view of the universe, which is, as you mentioned, geocentric. The Earth is at the center, and that was kind of the natural. When you think about it, our reference point is the Earth. That's how we observe the universe. We are on Earth, and so it is natural to start with that as kind of I would call it like the null hypothesis, right? The default view of the universe is that we're in the center and everything is kind of revolves around us, and we observe the revolution of the heavens around us. And in that model, which again, we're kind of standing on the shoulders of giants. There was a lot of astronomers in the classical tradition, a lot of theorizing about how the world is put together. I mean, Aristotle and even some of the earlier Greek philosophers theorized about the different types of heavens. And by the time we get to Dante, it was already pretty much established that there were 8 or 9 heavens. There was some debate about the exact number, but there were 7 planets that everybody discovered. And by planets or stars, we're talking about the heavenly bodies, right? So they didn't have that distinction of planet versus star because there wasn't enough sort of theoretical...
Or even moon, right?
Or even moon, yeah. Everything was like a star, right? Whatever you see in the sky, that's a star or a heavenly body. And so there were 7 of those, including the sun and the moon, and then the other planets that were visible with the naked eye. So each one of those occupied like a hollow sphere enveloping the Earth, starting with the closest celestial body, which is the moon.
Yeah.
And incidentally, there was speculation that the moon is this borderline between the world that is corruptible and changeable and the world that is incorruptible and eternal. And so, and the reason for that is because the moon is the one that has spots on it. It wanes and waxes. It has like these changeable characteristics. The other planets do not, at least from the visible observation. They appear to be impervious to change.
Like you can go out on any night of the week and see Jupiter.
Well, not necessarily, but you can at least, it's very predictable and it looks exactly the same.
When you do see it.
When you do see it, exactly.
I see.
Whereas the moon, which is closest to us, we can see certain imperfections, if you will.
Okay.
It was even like, I guess I think Canto 1 or Canto 2, I think Dante asks Beatrice about the nature of these impurities on the moon. And they in the best of scholastic tradition, they engage in this argument about what's causing that. But anyway, that's the model of the physical celestial bodies. But then there was speculation, well, what's happening with the stars? Because you do have those distant stars, the Big Dipper, the North Star, and so on.
Yeah.
So that was a separate heaven, right, beyond the 7 planets,
okay.
right? That was the 8th one. And then beyond that, Dante and others speculated there was actually another sphere. That's the sphere that drove the motion of all the others. That's the primum mobile, or the prime mover of the entire cosmos. And beyond that, even you have that's the 9th heaven.
Yeah.
Beyond that, you have the again, theoretically, you have the dwelling of God. That's the Empyrean, which is a place that is placeless, right? It's everywhere and nowhere, but it is enveloping all the other spheres. That's the Empyrean, the presence of God. And that's where we end up at the end of our cosmic journey, right?
Yeah.
That's where we get to.
I was thinking we could talk a little bit now about some of like the symbolism involved, because a lot of these planets will have certain ties to certain Greek gods and goddesses. So some of the more obvious ones, we have like Venus being love, the goddess of love or lust, I guess, as well. But yeah, so maybe
certainly let's talk about that. And I find this really fascinating, the interplay with the classical tradition, right? So you mentioned Venus. Venus has been associated with the goddess of love in different traditions, not just the Greek, but just in general in the Eastern tradition. I would say it's associated with love, perhaps because it's beautiful. It's a morning star. It has all these kind of interesting qualities that are associated with beauty. Mars, the reddish planet, you can see how that could be associated with war and bloodshed and so on. Mercury, which is the speediest of the planets, it has the shortest time of orbiting the sun, is associated with Hermes, the god who's the messenger, right? Messengers are supposed to be fast.
Gotcha. So
at least in theory.
It's not just arbitrary.
No, it's not arbitrary at all. And so Dante borrows all of that tradition. And again, I want to mention that in the medieval mindset, and we have to kind of get out of our mindset where everything is compartmentalized and we don't really think of physical realities corresponding to something deeper, some deeper truth. But in medieval mindset, it was definitely correlated like that, because everything is part of this overall design. When you think of the cosmos, you think of, okay, everything is designed from a particular standpoint, and everything converges to illustrate the same truths throughout. The universe being just another way of communicating those truths. In fact, I think it was said something like that nature is, or the Bible is the first of God's books, and nature is another.
Oh, okay.
Right. So you can read from both books, and they are supposed to be in concert with each other. So that idea, that sort of understanding of the world, is where we get this symbolism and connection of the planets with specific qualities. And that's how Dante, of course, orients himself when describing the journey. As we journey through the moon, as we journey to the moon, to Mars, to Sun, and so on, we encounter different virtues, different modes of being. Like Saturn is more contemplative and associated with temperance, right? As opposed to maybe Venus, which is more passionate and associated with perhaps being overly zealous or overly engaged with earthly types of pursuits, right?
Well, and I was thinking as you were saying that, even that I don't think is arbitrary, in that, you know, when you kind of look at where Saturn is as opposed to where Venus is, it makes sense that Saturn is the more kind of contemplative place, because it kind of existing on the furthest out. So you're able to kind of gain some like literal perspective as you're kind of looking back. And as we'll see when Dante gets to Saturn, there's kind of a few tercets where he is actually looking back down at Earth and kind of gaining some perspective on the everyday trifles and things that are kind of hard to see when you're kind of in it.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that just makes me think all of this is, very intentional, which
right.
for Dante, not surprising.
Right.
There's this theme that we've already seen kind of going through purgatory, which is as they ascend up the mount of purgatory, they actually become kind of physically lighter. And the symbolism there is they're no longer weighed down by their sins. So at this point, they're almost kind of like weightless. And in that, like, the first thing that happens is Beatrice stares into the sun, and then Dante kind of follows suit. And then the two of them, I don't exactly understand how it's, happening, but they're kind of like transported up to the first tier, which is the moon.
Yeah. Yeah. So the physics in Paradiso are, again, connected to spiritual realities, right? We think of motion as being a physical phenomenon driven by gravity or whatnot. But in Dante's mind, motion is, at least in the heavens, is not driven by physics, is driven by spiritual realities. And so the reality that is causing them to float upwards, if you will, is their desire for God and God's desire for them. It's like that's what gravity is in that realm, is this, they're pulled into these higher heavens by that mutual desire.
So they're kind of pulled towards God's gravitational pull.
God's gravitational pull, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And what was holding him back, why he wasn't able to alight earlier, is because, like you said, he was held down by his imperfections in his will, whether it was those different sins, the 7 Ps, right, the 7 peccatas that we have gotten rid of as we were ascending the Mount of Purgatory. So once that's all dealt with, those weights are essentially lifted, and now he's, as Beatrice puts it would be strange if you didn't float up, right? He is amazed that he is, but she's saying, no, that's kind of the natural direction, right? Just like it's natural for a stone to come back to earth when you throw it into the air, it's more natural in this realm to float up into the heavens, because, like you said, God is exerting that gravitational pull on you.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting for a few different reasons. I think a lot of believers have this feeling that we all have this kind of God-shaped hole in our hearts, and that what that is us kind of wanting to be reunited with the Creator. Do you think this is the similar kind of idea, or is it a different kind of an idea, the reason why there is this kind of pull towards God?
It's an interesting question. I think once we get to closer to the entrance into the starry heaven, and we get catechized by Peter, John, and James, I think John is the one that's going to give us an answer to that. In running ahead a little bit, I would just say that the pull is desire for good. And that can be completely abstracted away from the Christian tradition or any other religious tradition, for that matter.
Yeah.
People are attracted to what is good in general, right? Now, the conception of the good might vary, but in general, that's what we're attracted to. And so it's a natural path for us to move towards the good. What's holding us back is different imperfections of our character. A lot of times, so Dante's path, Dante's project is to show us how to, first of all, get rid of those weights that keep us from attaining the good. Yeah. And then show us what his conception of the good is, and we can agree or disagree with that. But then the last part of it is really, once you've grasped that, then the natural progression is to go towards that. And that's what, that's what love is essentially following that. You see, that's why, in so many words, this is why we're supposed to love God, because he is good. That's the, the kind of the Eli 5 type of, explanation of that.
No, that's great. Let's start going through some of the cantos. So I'm just going to read the first couple tercets of Canto 1. Quote, "The glory of him who moves all things rays forth through all the universe and is reflected from each thing in proportion to its worth. I have been in that heaven of his most light, and what I saw, those who descend from there lack both the knowledge and the power to write. For as our intellect draws near its goal, it opens to such depths of understanding as memory cannot plumb within the soul. Nevertheless, whatever portion time still leaves me of the treasures of that kingdom shall now become the subject of my rhyme." I read this as almost kind of like a bit of an apology. He's kind of saying up front, like, I had this epic vision of God and this, cosmic journey, but forgive me for not being able to explain it. And he's kind of hinting here, the reason he's not able to explain it was, one, because he kind of lacks the memory, and it's something that can only be experienced through experience. Mm-hmm. There's not really a way to kind of capture it with words or with armchair philosophizing.
Right. And we'll see that throughout. He's definitely struggling to express concepts that are, in his mind, beyond language. And the limits of language is a big subject of the Commedia in general, the nature of language and its limits.
Yeah.
We have in this third book of the Commedia several instances where the speaker actually is speaking in tongues that are unutterable or unexplainable, unintelligible to us, which signals the fact that human language has definite limits in terms of conceptualizing reality.
Yeah.
But what's also interesting is the planets themselves. As we read on, we realize that the planets themselves are not the dwelling place of saints that we encounter there. They're there because they're there for Dante's sake, to elucidate certain aspects of their station in heaven, but really all the saints are in the Empyrean. So when we think of, like, how can you be in two places at the same time, which is, we're thinking in physical terms, whereas here you really can't do that because it's not a physical laws do not really apply here anymore. Right. That's his point. And so whatever physical imagery is used, it's only used because of the limitations of our understanding and language. We cannot grasp these transcendent truths any other way except by reference to things that we can see.
That's a great point. And that kind of brings us a little bit back to talking about the geography or cosmology of Paradiso, in that, we're going to visit all of these different planets, but it's important to note that in reality, none of the souls are actually here. They're all kind of circling God on his throne in this Imperium place, which is a place that is outside the realms of time and space.
A placeless place, yeah.
But yeah, because we're mortal humans, we can't really conceptualize that. He needs to kind of lay it out in this framework where we're still kind of jumping from planet to planet.
Right.
No, that's really great. The other thing, I guess, this first canto made me think of, a lot of the Eastern philosophy I read, a lot of times in the foreword, the author starts with a similar kind of apology, basically saying, like, hey, just so you know, reading this book is not going to kind of lead you to the answers. The real answers is to actually, do the meditation or do the yoga or whatever the tradition. I think this is a similar kind of thing that Dante is saying here, in that, like, at a certain point, you kind of have to actually get in the water.
Yeah, I think it's definitely that. That's definitely the case. But also, I'm thinking more pragmatically. We have a carrot and a stick situation, right? So we use the stick in Inferno, but now we also need a carrot. And you can't just tell people like the negative stuff. You have to give them something to aspire towards.
Sure.
So even though we cannot grasp these realities until we get there, if we ever get there, Dante is still eager to paint some representation, even if it's imperfect, even if it's, but he does give a lot of disclaimers as we go through this. So the book is full of them. It's a disclaimer upon disclaimer. And as we get closer to the beatific vision of the Godhead, the disclaimers just start piling up.
Right.
So he is certainly trying to create a sense that whatever he's describing is so beyond words that you shouldn't get hung up on the words. Yeah. And yet, to be fair to him, he's doing a pretty damn good job.
Yeah.
I mean, the picture that he paints is incredible, and it's innovative and it's beautiful, and it's
if anybody's going to be able to describe the indescribable, it would be Dante or a poet like him. The other thing that happens in this first canto, which is kind of along the same lines, is he kind of creates his own word, this transhumanism, which I guess, today maybe means something a little bit different. Today you kind of hear it when you're talking about like cyborgs and AI, kind of humans merging with technology. But my understanding is he's kind of talking about transhumanism more in the sense that, like, in order to kind of understand some of these deeper truths, we can no longer kind of talk about them and view them from like an objective standpoint where we're kind of looking on them. We can almost only experience that by kind of merging with it and becoming part of it.
I think that's good. Yeah, I think that's good. I would say, though, I'm not sure that it's really that much different from our modern use of the word. At least when I was thinking about it, I thought, wow, this is interesting. You don't really associate the Middle Ages with talks about transhumanism.
Elon Musk, yeah.
But here, Elon Musk and so on. But here it is. Dante is using this term, transhumano, to say that we're at this stage in our journey where we need to really take ourselves out of ourselves, right, and go beyond. And he uses several interesting references to the classical tradition again. One is this story of Glaucus, who was transformed from a human to a god by eating some sort of herb, I think. And so you have this transmutation, right, from human to divine. That's an interesting way of thinking about it. Then you also have this reference to Marsyas, a little more violent, but still along those same lines. Marsyas challenged Apollo to a music contest, and of course we know how that ends. Apollo, in his anger, skinned him alive, so he essentially took him out of his human sheath and unsheathed him.
Yeah.
And so both pictures talk about really taking what's human and transmuting it into something that is, it's not clear what it is, but it's not human anymore. It's beyond human. So in that sense, I feel like it's very similar to what we're experiencing today with, talks about cyborgs and implanting different things into us. And at some point, are we just going to be brains floating around in this semi or immaterial? I think it's
uploaded into the metaverse.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think it's actually a surprisingly modern terminology and modern conception. Now, of course, he applies it not for fun and games, but for him, it's a journey to reality. And the only way you can achieve that is through this transmutation. I use the word transmutation on purpose because that's the word that's used in the context of alchemy. Yeah. And the alchemists thought that they could transmute metals from the more gross to the more noble, to gold specifically as the end state. But also the idea there was that it's the metal transmutation is just the outward reflection of the inner journey that the person that's engaged in this is going through. In other words, he is really traveling to, in his understanding of the world, and he's trying to get to the ultimate truth. Yeah. It's not just about getting money or getting gold or whatever per se. It's the journey to purify yourself and to achieve a certain enlightenment, if you will. So this journey of Dante is a kind of an answer to both the astrology tradition and the alchemy tradition. Alchemy, incidentally, Dante is not crazy about. If you remember in Inferno, we meet an alchemist there, and he is being punished as a deceiver, he's a fraud, basically.
Yeah, right.
So Dante is not crazy about the alchemy in its most kind of vulgar sense, but he is definitely pursuing that idea of transmutation and achieving a particular end. And so this is an interesting way of how he answers this journey.
That's really great. Maybe we can move on. We're not going to have time to go through every canto, but we kind of picked and chose some of the ones that we thought were kind of significant to dive into. So the first sphere that they visit is the moon. And this is associated with faith.
So in the first three planets, there's still this idea that they are furthest away from the Empyrean, and the saints there are furthest away in their experience of God because of some lack of experience that they, in serving God, that they had incurred a certain rank that is lower than others. And so there's this idea of deserts, even in Paradiso, so you don't get away from that. So in other words, some saints' experience of the ultimate reality is higher than others because of their devotion on earth, which is meant to, maybe perhaps I guess it's meant to motivate us, but it's also maybe hard to swallow. How come you still have this sort of divisions and different stations and so on? And Dante raises that question of justice. And specifically, it's interesting in the context of Picarda, a saint that he meets in the sphere of the moon. Picarda was a nun. She gave the vow of abstinence. And what happened to her was kind of tragic. She was forced to marry against her will. Yeah. So somebody literally abducted her from that monastery that she was in and married her off. It was for political reasons and so on.
Yeah.
And yet, she is being punished for something that she presumably did not control. So Dante raises...
breaking her vow
Breaking her vow. And so Dante raises this question to Beatrice, what's going on here? Where's justice in that?
Yeah.
And Beatrice's answer is that is interesting because it underpins this focus of Dante on the importance and the value of free will. Dante is all about free choice and free will and our ability, our volition, our ability to choose right from wrong. Yeah. And he says that even if things happen that we cannot control, we can internally resist it and even go to martyrdom if we really feel strongly about it. So the fact that she did not is a blemish on her record, if you and so she is suffering for that. But really, it all comes back to this importance of a vow that is freely given, and that has consequences if you do not keep it.
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough one. How can you fault somebody who was abducted and forced to marry against their will?
He does, and just to again round it out. So he does bring up counterexamples of situations where people went almost beyond. Again, speaking of human, this is almost going beyond human ability. But there are several examples, maybe it's apocryphal, but in Roman history, where you have these amazing Romans who would literally die for their beliefs. And there's a story of, I forget the guy's name, but he put his hand in the fire and let the fire burn him to illustrate that that there was nothing his enemy was going to do to him to make him betray his people. Yeah. That story, it could very well be true because that was the kind of the Roman ideal, right? It doesn't matter what happens to you. There are certain things that you must do as part of your duty. And so
Yeah.
that was the counterexample to Picard, who, okay, yes, things happen to you couldn't control, but you could also, there was still always a choice that you can make. Of course, also there's a story of Lucretia, who commits suicide when she is dishonored. So there could be, and it's hard to again, it's hard for us to think of these scenarios in the context of modern.
Well, I don't know
experience.
that it is. I mean, you have the one that I was thinking of. There's a story in World War II where one of the, I guess, a Nazi soldier was told to basically fire at, a pack of Jewish people and refused, and they were like, "All right, you can either do it or you can join them, and we'll fire at you." And he said, "I'd rather join them," and he did. So, I mean, I think. Maybe what this is getting at is the idea that always is a way to determine your free will, even if that means kind of your death.
Right. And I'll also say this. Sometimes when you read Dante and his discussions of justice, it's obvious that he himself is not necessarily fully convinced by himself, by his own arguments. So later on, we'll talk about the justice of condemning non-believers who live so far beyond
maybe
the
we
Christian
can
sphere. Or we can
do that now.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about the same subject of justice and desert. And so how does that work, right? And so you always have these questions that really have no answer.
And just for context, this is when they reach Jupiter, which is the planet of justice. This is one of the questions Dante raises.
Correct.
Like, what happens to people who never heard the word of Jesus Christ?
Right.
Yeah.
So there is no good answer there. The answers that are given are kind of standard answers of, well, who are you to question God's providence? And by the way, you don't know if they deserved it. So it's along those same lines. And this is actually very problematic for Dante, and I'll explain why. So there are two emphases, right, in his sort of moral universe. One is this emphasis on free will, that we just talked about. The second one, though, is the emphasis on reason. If you cannot explain rationally the reasons for something being just or unjust, then it becomes arbitrary. And so this explanation of, well, where were you when I created the world, kind of circumvents that whole process, right?
Yeah.
Where is reason in that? Where is our agreement?
It's a trump card.
It's a trump card. It's a joker. It's a non-answer.
Yeah.
Because, and again, we'll see this in the Catechism. Reason is tied up with moral behavior, because you have to agree internally that something is good before you can do it, right? And so if you take reason out of the equation, you're left with fanaticism, right? You just have to take God at his word, essentially. And that's a problem. That's a problem for Dante, because he is very much into reasoned love, right? His book is about love, but it's a love that's congruent with reason.
Yeah.
He loves Beatrice not just because she is a pretty girl, but because she has certain qualities that he recognizes in her that are good. And that he idealizes her, perhaps, to a degree. But the point is, it's not, if she was just pretty, there are a lot of pretty girls. But there was something about her that set off something much deeper than just attraction. It was admiration of her character.
Yeah.
And he thought about her his whole life. And so the place of reason is supreme in his poetry, in his outlook on the world. And now when he comes to these questions that don't have an answer, a reasonable answer, he's struggling. And we can see that it's like evident in his answers. Yes, he's kind of preaching to himself and trying to convince himself, but not entirely sure that he does at the end of the day.
Well, and this goes back to our first discussion in Inferno. We were talking about where Dante puts a lot of the pagan writers who came before God. I mean, it's pretty much the same conundrum.
Correct.
And most of the time he puts them in limbo, but yet there are some that are in purgatory, some that are in paradise.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we can talk a little bit about kind of what happens on the planet of Jupiter, because we kind of just dove into the ethical questions that are raised here. But there's some interesting.
Can we go back to Mars before we jump to Jupiter? Because on Mars,
for sure.
On Mars, we meet a very
We're jumping
special
around planets.
we meet a very special person who is Dante's great grandfather.
Good call. Yeah. Let's talk about
we have to talk about him, because this is really an amazing part of the Paradiso, where we meet this very notable and interesting character, Cacciaguida. So why is he so interesting? Well, he's in the sphere of Mars, and he is in the sphere of Mars for a very good reason, because he was actually part of the Second Crusade. He was part of the church militant in a literal sense, when that meant literally going to battle against the infidels and trying to carve out parts of the Holy Land from the Muslims. So this is super interesting. Dante meeting his ancestor, and the dynamics there are nothing short of really spectacular, because Cacciaguida is both a patriarch and a very, I would say, kind of like the role model of conservatism. And Dante, who himself is not necessarily, I wouldn't call him necessarily a conservative type of person, because he's very inquisitive and very open-minded, yet he is swayed in a lot of ways by his great grandfather. So it's interesting to have this conversation between them, or to observe their conversation, because Dante is he's very, very humble to meet him. He feels like this is a person that he served as like a guiding star for him. At the same time, some of his notions they do sound a little, not off, but they're just quaint, yeah, to us. I mean, this is a person who's like, well, let's talk about the good old times, and when men were really men and women were really women, and so on. And it kind of boils down to, we were much better off when we were poor. Because Florence, as we know, has experienced this tremendous economic boom in the last 200 years before Dante's birth. And the result of that was this, as people get more money, as people get more wealth, they want to experience the world in ways that they simply were not capable of before. And a lot of times it goes to excess. Right. And so you have all of this corruption, you have all of these political factions, you have strife and jealousy and so on. But Dante's great-grandfather sees the root of that not in human nature per se, but in as a kind of outgrowth of just the wealth and the growth of civilization and culture. And so his idea is, well, women should not adorn themselves, and they should just tend to the babies and tend to their sewing, and men should wear plain clothes and so on. Like it seems incongruous with everything that we've heard, and yet Dante seems very much impressed by all of that, and he buys it wholesale, or at least he seems to. What's interesting also is to watch Beatrice as she is standing there observing this conversation, and she coughs.
Oh, really?
She coughs, and this is really good. And Dante says she coughed as one of the ladies who observed Queen Guinevere's first fault. So this is a reference to Guinevere and Lancelot when the two of them are ready to kind of jump into this affair. One of the ladies in waiting coughs to kind of say to Guinevere and to Lancelot.
It's like a passive objection.
Right, like, hey, what are you guys doing?
Yeah, probably the only objection a woman could make at that point. Yeah,
Beatrice does the same thing to tell Dante, or to maybe alert him to the fact, look, you shouldn't honor this man more than he really deserves. And this idea that you might be kind of elevating him a little too much, because he happens to be your blood, and this idea of nobility and idea of noble birth and all of that. It's kind of like, and we know that Dante, one of his sins that's peculiar to him, or things that he's struggling with, is pride. So the fact that he is now enamored by his ancestor in Paradiso of all places, right? Is a little incongruous.
So and some of the message there is to not take pride in your family. I mean, that sounds worse than I think it is, but maybe not take pride in the sense that, oh, my ancestor was this great person, therefore I'm this great person.
Yeah, in Europe is, famous for all of this heirs of aristocracy and noble birth and blood. And, we have the blue blood expression here. All of that to say that Dante is against this idea of virtue being passed through blood.
Yeah.
He doesn't believe in that. Yet he seems to kind of forget himself a little bit over here.
Right.
His grandfather mentions several things that are somewhat even, not necessarily racist, but definitely elitist in a way that he says, Florence would have been better off if we just stuck with the Florentine families, and none of these outsiders came in and diluted our pure
typical grandfather.
Yeah. I mean, it's really good. It's really good like that, and it sounds very off to us today, but in those times, maybe it didn't, because Florence was experiencing, and maybe even today, like with immigrants and immigration issues. I mean, all of these things are still up for debate, right? They're still being discussed as, like, maybe we shouldn't dilute the American population with all of these immigrants or something like that. I mean, that's essentially what he's saying.
Yeah.
And he sees that as the root or one of the causes of Florentine demise and corruption. So, yeah.
Well, and where that kind of makes me go is there's this kind of egalitarian, nonpartisanness about Paradise, in that we see people from all different political parties, even the parties that, in Dante's life were his enemies. We see them in Paradise. We also see like people who are related to each other in Paradise, right, and Inferno. So he is kind of making a statement in just how he, chooses to put different souls in these different stages. He's making the point that it is about kind of you as an individual and your kind of merit, rather than, oh, you came from this family, therefore you're just automatically going to get to go to Paradise.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely the case. So we have, I think in Purgatory, we saw several Ghibellines and Black Guelphs on their way to heaven, even though both of those parties were antagonistic to Dante, and it doesn't make a difference. So the party affiliation is not what determines your merit before God. Yeah. So that's a great equalizer in this discussion. And in Paradiso, you're absolutely right. There are all sorts of people that you would not expect there. There are all sorts of people you would not expect in hell, right? All the popes and all the important people and people that have stature. So yes, it's a great equalizer. But in Paradiso especially, what's even more interesting is, even if you have people that are kind of in the same camp, but on the different sides of that camp, you have people that are, instead of elevating their own tribe, they're elevating the other. And that is meant to showcase the relationships, the kind of like the idealized society, right? What does it look like if a person is actually freed from corruption and tribalism and selfishness and this constant desire to propel themselves to the number one spot? What does it look like? Well, it looks like this. And we have a situation where you have a Dominican describing and praising Saint Francis, who is a Franciscan, and then you have a Franciscan who is describing the life of Dominic, Saint Dominic, the founder of the Dominican order. So you have this constant preference of the other person to yourself, and they're so cordial and so kind of I don't say in love with each other, but that's what it is. It's like they are looking at each other's merits, and it makes them glad as opposed to making them envious. So yeah.
No, and it's just, I mean, it's nice to see. We obviously don't have to talk politics now, but we're on the verge of a big political election in the United States here, and I couldn't help reading this just feeling a little refreshed, because essentially a lot of Dante's message is that, there's things that are deeper than party lines. Mm-hmm. So let's now that we've kind of covered a bit of Mars, let's go back to Jupiter and talk a little bit about what happens there. We talked about some of the themes that get brought up on Jupiter, about divine justice, but let's talk about the eagle. This is a really interesting part of the Commedia. Yeah.
So when we get to Jupiter, Dante has this vision of an eagle. It's interesting because we saw an eagle in Purgatory, and it was a kind of a picture of Christ. But here, an eagle is most likely a corporate entity, right? So it's not, he says of him, we, right? When I say I really mean we. That's what the eagle says. So he's describing himself as this corporate entity, which probably refers to government, right? Whether, and most likely to some sort of imperial government, which Dante was very much in favor of. Dante pretty much worshipped Roman emperors and thought of them as the greatest rulers ever, despite all of their shortcomings. So anyway, so the eagle in some ways represents this just government that pretty much is the symbol, right, symbolized by Jupiter. Jupiter is a symbol of justice, symbol of authority, right? In the Greek mythology, Jupiter is Zeus, right, the head of all the gods. So we are talking about justice, and we this is obviously not a new concept, not a novel concept for Jupiter, because we encountered justice when we were back on the moon, and we didn't really talk about Justinian, but Justinian is the one that codified Roman law into an actual written legal document, a set of documents known as the Code of Justinian. In Jupiter, we now meet all the different rulers who enforced this code. Whether
they're all kind of in these various parts of the eagle formation.
Right. All of these rulers that played some role in either justice or militant exploits for the church. Some of them were part of the Crusades. Like we mentioned, Cacciaguida was also a crusader, so Crusades are definitely part of this idea. And then you also have this very interesting saintly dance. So we should mention this, that throughout the journey, the saints are not stationary, but they're always kind of whirling around. They're always like in this some sort of motion that a lot of times is presented as dancing. So they're like, it's
singing too.
Singing, dancing. Yeah, it's a very kind of dynamic place. But in this case, what's interesting to me is the saints, as they are forming around Jupiter, they're forming these different letters. So it's almost like the original flash mob being portrayed here. And what they're spelling out is in Latin, and I'm going to slaughter this, but diligite justitiam qui judicatis terram, which means love justice, ye who judge the earth. Which makes sense, right? It's an appeal to the rulers to follow justice, those people that are in authority to follow that. So, yeah, I think, but it's a beautiful picture of this. Like I said, I'm thinking of it as like a saintly flash mob.
I love it. And then there's the whole discussion around whether what happens to people who haven't heard the word of God, which we've already kind of mentioned. Yeah. What do you say we keep on moving? So after Jupiter, we have Saturn, and then we come to the fixed stars. So this is where there is a catechism or a jury. Basically, this is kind of like Dante's final exam before he can see God.
Absolutely.
He's kind of quizzed on what he's learned so far. And the examiners are St. Peter, St. James, and St. John. St. Peter questions him on the virtue of faith.
Correct.
St. James quizzes him on the virtues of hope, and St. John on the virtues of love. And Again, we don't have time to go through all of them. We were thinking we'd kind of zoom in on St. John, though, here.
Right. And we already, I think, touched on it a little bit, but we can go in a little more detail here. So John is the apostle of love, but where does love originate? That's the real question. Like, what is driving this? And the answer that Dante gives, which is correct, is goodness. The reason you aim your bow at God, which is how he puts it, is because that's where goodness is.
Yeah.
So and how do you understand that? Well, again, it's through two things. One is authority, which is kind of like to say revelation, but the other is reason. And reason to me is like more central to Dante, I would say, because reason is that it's based on Aristotelian ethics. It's based on all of this kind of infrastructure built out in the classical tradition of what is good. And we can understand that, and because it corresponds to a lot of the Christian teaching, it kind of makes sense, right? It makes sense that we have this sort of unison of the two different sources, and maybe even more sources, right? As you look out in nature, and you look out into the classical tradition, you look out into the Bible, and it's this confluence of different sources that all tell you kind of the same thing.
Great. Well, he passes the examination, we should say, and it'd be a really letdown if he got this far in there.
That's right. Very anticlimactic.
And yeah, they move now to the Prima Mobile. How do you pronounce that?
Prima Mobile.
Prima Mobile. This is the prime mover. Right. This is kind of what stirs the pot. As we mentioned, it moves all of the other planets and spheres.
Right.
Then we move to the final sphere, which is the Imperium.
Right.
Which is not, it doesn't exist in time or space.
Right. Sometimes it is called the 10th heaven, but it's really not a heaven. It's outside of the 9 heavens, right? So with this, you have 7 planets, right? Then you have the fixed stars. That's the kind of the 8th heaven. Prima Mobile is the 9th heaven, and then Empyrean, I guess, would be the 10th, but it's not really a heaven. It's a placeless place, right? It's a spiritual location which is everywhere and nowhere, and yet we still see some sort of physical manifestation, because if we didn't, how would we describe it, right?
Right.
And so what we see is this amazing symbology, right? Again, it's a symbology because it's not a real thing, but the symbol of it, the one that Dante comes up with as a way to describe it, is this beautiful white rose. And the saints are kind of embedded in this rose as if it were an amphitheater, right? At different levels, and in the center there is God. And again, when I say center, it's a picture, right? Because God is everywhere, but the idea is, if the closer you are, the more your experience of seeing the divinity is enhanced, right? So it's like and so of course you have like Mary is the closest to that. You have Adam and Eve and all the different Old Testament saints, and there's like basically like these VIP seats,
right,
in this amphitheater. Yeah. But of course, they are assigned by merit and by your kind of importance in this. I guess your merit before God in this world. So, but then you have angels. And the idea, angels are like bees that are collecting nectar from the center and then distributing it, effusing it throughout the rest of the rose. And they're like these translucent beings, so they never obstruct your view of God. And yet they're like fluttering around, and like not little, but like bees, literally, is the word he uses. Bees gathering nectar and honey. They are spreading this fragrance, right, of God's presence throughout the rose. So that's the picture.
It's incredible. Well, and we should say too, like, this is where this kind of like dualistic way of looking at things kind of breaks down. So this realm is kind of full of paradoxes and kind of contradictions. Like you said, there's really not a hierarchy when it comes to how close souls are to God, but yet we do have this kind of hierarchy. We see the Trinity in the center of this rose. And that's kind of the ultimate paradox, is how can God be three and one simultaneously? But before we get to that, do we want to talk about Saint Bernard?
Yes, absolutely.
Dante's final guide.
Yes, let's talk about him. So Saint Bernard, or Bernard of Clairvaux, very interesting saint.
And I'll just say before, when they first enter the Imperium and they see this rose, Dante turns to Beatrice, and she is gone. She's gone.
Yep.
So this is, there's this man standing there,
right?
And this is Saint Bernard. So sorry.
Continue. No worries. What's interesting too is, this is where it's not clear. So Dante intimates at one point that people in paradise don't really have an age, or put it another way, they're all about 33, which is the age that, of Christ, which is kind of like the perfect age, right? And yet,
it's also the age most people report feeling throughout their life, even as they age. Anyways, fun fact.
Yeah, fact, right? It makes sense, right? It's the age where you feel like you've reached your the apex of your kind of being, right? Mm-hmm. You're fully formed, you're mature, you've reached your potential. And yet, when we meet Saint Bernard, he's an old man. So how do you reconcile that, right?
Another contradiction.
It's a little bit of a contradiction there. But leaving that aside, so Saint Bernard is a really interesting guide, an appropriate guide for this portion, because he is known for his mysticism. He is an author of several Christian hymns that are still sung in churches. And they're all about this kind of a mystical relationship with God, meaning you can actually, how do you actually experience God today? Not just waiting for the afterlife, but how do you converse with him and have some sort of intercourse with God today? And so he was known for these devotional books on prayer and conversing with God in your everyday life and so on. So very appropriate here, because what we're seeing is a very mystical, magical, whatever we want to call it, a transcendental experience, the transhuman experience, right, that we've talked about before. Mm-hmm. And so he is the perfect guide for that. And then Beatrice, as you mentioned, she is kind of transported. What's the word that I'm trying to think of? Star Trek, when you...
Not teleport.
Yeah, like teleport.
Is it teleport?
Yeah, teleported basically to the center of this rose. Okay. And Bernard says
she joins her place in the choir.
In the yes. So Bernard says, "Look, don't worry. She is, she didn't go anywhere. She's right there. Look at the center. Look closer to the center. You can see her third row. I mean, he literally says that. So it's like, again, it's like this rose is like an amphitheater at a game. So. And I should mention one other thing. So one thing that Saint Bernard was very famous for is his devotion to Mary. So some would even say he worshipped Mary. So Mariology, if you will. Mary, who is definitely portrayed here as the center of attention. I would say almost. I mean, she doesn't eclipse Christ, but she is definitely kind of mentioned many more times and much more described much more explicitly than Christ, even though Christ is mentioned several times by Justinian and some of the others. But she is definitely the center point of this rose, and she is obviously in the first row. And so Saint Bernard then addresses her, not God, but Mary, to grant Dante ability to see God, essentially, to join this rose, not maybe, again, literally, but figuratively, to gain a glimpse of this beatific vision. And so the last canto is his prayer to Mary to grant this wish.
Right, that's how it begins.
Mm-hmm.
And after she grants the wish, Dante has his vision of God unfiltered.
So what do we see in this vision, this beatific vision? This is, the destination towards which we have been traveling throughout the Commedia. Mm-hmm. Let me maybe summarize it by an expression used by Beatrice when she was describing the Empyrean as a whole, which is, she says, this is light intellectual. We're seeing light, but it's light of, again, light of reason and light of conceptions, like pure conceptions symbolized through some material object, right? Circles, wheels, lights, etc. But really what we're seeing is concepts that are super mysterious and intertwined in this vision. So one of the first things that Dante looks upon is, what's interesting, is a volume, a book. Now, of course, not a literal book. What is it? It's a book of history that has both, he calls it substances, accidents, and the interplay between them. So the interplay between what is necessary versus what is accidental. This is another one of those interesting scholastic discussions about like determinism, right, in the world. Is everything predetermined? Some people would say yes, everything is just, it's a physical universe. We know all the atoms, we know everything. Everything I say right now is just some interplay of atoms from eons past, right? Fully determined. And then some others would say no, there's some randomness, there's some swerving away from that. So Dante sees the answer to this question of how the two interplay, interact with each other, the necessary and the accidental, the random and the predetermined. So that's super interesting that's what he's seeing. He's not seeing some, I don't know, just some rubies or some emeralds, just like in Revelation, it's all about kind of the light show. But here it's an intellectual vision. It's a vision that answers these deepest questions of reality, of being. And one of them is the nature of history, the nature of what's necessary versus what's accidental. So that's number one. It's super interesting that he chooses this as his focal point. Another one is this simile or this reference to the vision as being like fading right away. So it's not something you can hold in your hand. It's not something you can take away with you. It's something that you can experience, like you said, but it's not something you can write down and, like present it as here's an answer. Here's the ultimate equation of the world.
Kind of like waking from a dream.
Yeah. And he uses two similes. One is the snow and the footprints on the snow that disappear as soon as the sun's rays melt it. The second one, which is even more interesting, is the idea of writing down Sibyl's prophecies on leaves. So this, again, harkens back to the Aeneid and Virgil, and in general, this principle of that you wrote down whatever this Sibyl, the prophetess, would tell you is divine revelation. You would write it on leaves, and then the wind would scatter those leaves. So whatever you wrote down is not going to last. Yeah. Because it's meant for you now. It's not meant for anyone else, and it's not meant for later. It's like manna. You can't hoard it. You have to use it now, and that's it. And so Dante is basically saying, I saw this. I can't really give it to you. I can only say that it's like this ephemeral vision. This is the best I can do. Here's what I saw. I saw the answer to the ultimate questions there. The ultimate questions of causality and determinism and randomness. The other one is this question of squaring the circles.
Well, before we get there, it made me think of like Joseph Campbell, and this idea of Joseph Campbell's is a lot of times on the hero's journey, after the hero kind of receives the boon or the treasure, there's this typical theme of the hero not being able to kind of return the boon to the community or to the society. And the way that he describes it is there's a lot of times it's like, as soon as the hero in the myth kind of grabs the treasure, it will kind of fall to ash in his hand. And I think maybe what Dante is saying here is, he had this incredible kind of spiritual experience, but the moment it was over, he couldn't remember most of it. He was just kind of left with this feeling. And some of the commentary I was reading, they were kind of suggesting the boon that Dante is kind of returning to the community, to use kind of Joseph Campbell's language here, is the Divine Comedy. So from this spiritual experience, as Dante is kind of saying, yes, this, what I've kind of captured or kind of returned is only a fraction of what the real thing is. This is still kind of my, him writing the Commedia is kind of the returning of the boon.
Absolutely. The Commedia is the boon, is the outgrowth of his vision. And it's something that he can give to us. But at the same time, he does give us all of these disclaimers that, yes, this is what I have written down, but it's just, don't think of it as exactly what I saw or exactly what happened. It's just leaves. It's
the best I could do.
The best I can do. It's ephemeral. It's so ungraspable, right? I can't hold it in my hand. And so whatever you're reading, it's like a child's play compared to what actually happened. So it's a device to actually elevate the importance of what he's talking about, right? If the beauty that we see in the Commedia is still miles below or away from the actual thing, then how beautiful is the real thing, right? It's a subtle way of like elevating the discourse to say, right, look, I'm just like, I'm nobody here. I'm like, it's like, it's humbling himself, but at the same time, it's subtly elevating the subject matter to, by doing this. So
he even calls his poetry kind of like baby talk compared to the real thing.
Right.
He says like, I have less power to speak than any infant wetting its tongue, yet at its mother's breast. Right. So, I mean, it's kind of self-deprecating there, but for the effect of kind of elevating what the experience is, like you mentioned.
And the task, he compares the task to squaring a circle, which, if you wonder what that is talking about, the idea is, can you come up with a square that equals that has the same area as a given circle? Which is impossible to do because the square of a circle is given by radius squared times pi. Pi is an irrational number, so you can't really come up with any square ever. In fact, I read about this on Wikipedia. This wasn't actually proven until like 1882. You couldn't do that.
I read the same thing.
Yeah, so it was an interesting task, but he's just saying like, he didn't know at the time. Of course, Dante didn't know it was impossible, but whatever he thought of it, it seemed like an impossible task. They didn't know for sure, but it seemed like an impossible task. So he's saying, for me to describe what I saw is just as impossible as squaring a circle.
Might as well. Yeah. That's good, because I think that'd be lost on most people, including myself when I first read it.
And of course, we should mention that the very last verse of the Commedia references stars. Every single book in the Commedia ends with stars, stelle in Italian, and we talked about stars as being symbolic of desire. So right here we have the fulfillment of desire that we have been following. This has been a journey of desire throughout, and now we finally have arrived. The desire is fulfilled in this vision of the Trinity and the ultimate mystery of God as these circles, which again harkens back to the book of Revelation, the book of Daniel, the book of Ezekiel. In the Bible, you have these visions of the Godhead as circles, which of course, circle is something perfect, right? And then you have the perfection of the circles as they're revolving and reflecting in each other. The reflection is, again, the symbology of giving and receiving from each other, like it's a loving kind of circle of love, if you will. So that's the vision, is this vision of the Godhead as these circles that encompass everything, and they're only known to themselves fully. That's the other thing that he mentions here, which is, probably a very conservative, like a basic tenet of theology, that no being can fully know God except for God himself, as he is. So that's the vision.
Well, in this last chapter reminded me a little bit of the chapter in the Bhagavad Gita where Arjuna has his vision of God kind of unfiltered as well. And at least in the Gita, the way they picture it is, God is Krishna, but also this vision that he has where there's, 1,000 tongues and 1,000 stomachs. Like there's kind of these two simultaneous realities. So it's just kind of interesting seeing the different, I'm very controversial to suggest that they're coming to the same conclusion there about the ultimate nature of reality. But I guess there's different ways of kind of trying to capture this, non-dual God image. Mm-hmm. Very fascinating. Well, this wraps up the entire piece. This has been incredible. One thing I was watching this course and the professor said something like, once you've finished reading the Commedia, then you're ready to read the Commedia. That's kind of the joke amongst people that are into Dante. And this has been, this is just my first reading of it, but you've done it a few times. Do you find that statement to be true? I do. It's definitely fathomless. Mm-hmm. It's like Shakespeare or the Bible. You can read it all your life and discover new things. It's so encyclopedic, and there's so many different rabbit trails that we had to omit hundreds of different most of different references. But it's a historical tour de force of the Middle Ages and the Christian history, which is the bedrock of Western civilization, really. So if you're interested in studying that, then it's a great starting point from a kind of a poetic literary standpoint. But I also want to say that beyond all of the minutia, I find the value in reading and rereading Dante because it gives me perspective. It's so far removed from the world that we're in today that reading something like this, it's like reading Plato or Aristotle or any of the other classics, because it forces you to look at the world from a different viewpoint. You don't have to agree with that viewpoint, by the way, to gain value from it. It just forces you to rethink, reevaluate what is good, right? What is detrimental to life? What is a good life? What is something that's worth pursuing, and how to think about that? It's basically participating in a conversation with history, right? And all the great thinkers that have gone before it. And it's a great way to examine, your own life, and something that we should all do. As Albert Einstein famously said, an unexamined life is not worth living. And I feel like that's something that we need to constantly do. And it's a great way to do that is by rereading the Commedia, if nothing else. And of course, there's beautiful poetry. So that's the other thing is, I feel like it's not like we talked about the Leaves of Sybil. It's not something you can grasp and say, well, I've read it, so I can just put a check mark on it. No, it's something that you have to come back to re-experience the wonder and the joy of it. And it's good. It's a good thing. Absolutely. It's a feature. Well, it's definitely had a profound effect on me going through it. So if anybody listening out there is on the fence, it's definitely worthwhile to read it. Well, thank you so much, Phil. I've enjoyed it too. Yeah, thank you for inviting me. This has been really great. Hey, this is Zach. Thanks for listening to Unpacking Ideas. If you're enjoying the podcast so far, be sure to follow it so that you get notified every time I release an episode. And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple, I'd really appreciate if you could take a few seconds to rate the show. This really helps with the algorithm so that more people can discover it. Also, if you would like to get in touch with me or to hear about what's coming up next on the podcast, visit unpackingideas.com/podcast. And there I post links to books and essays that we'll be discussing on future podcast episodes. All right, that's going to do it for today. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you next episode.